Keiko Tanaka lived in a small house at the end of a quiet street in rural Japan. The paint on her wooden fence was starting to chip, and her garden was full of vegetables she grew herself. At 78 years old, she had hands that told stories of hard work, years of kneading bread, folding clothes, and counting money at her late husband's grocery store. Every morning, Keiko would wake up at 6 and make tea the way her mother taught her. She would sit by her kitchen window watching the sun come up over the rice fields that stretched beyond her neighborhood. The silence in her house was different now. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of a busy life taking a break. It was the empty, kind of silence that comes when someone important is no longer there. Her husband Hiroshi had passed away 2 winters ago. They had been married for 53 years, and in all that time, Keiko had never really thought about what she wanted for herself. There was always something to do for the family, something to fix at the store, someone who needed her attention. She was the kind of woman who put everyone else first without even thinking about it. The grocery store had been their whole world. Every day for decades, she would help customers find what they needed, keep track of the money, and make sure the shelves were clean and organized. She knew every person in their small town by name. She knew who liked which brand of rice, whose children were getting married, and who was having trouble making ends meet. Sometimes she would slip an extra apple into someone's bag when they weren't looking, especially if she knew they were struggling. But there was something else about Keiko that most people didn't know. Late at night, after the store was closed, and Hiroshi was asleep, she would sometimes sit at their old piano. It was a small upright piano that had belonged to her mother-in-law, and it was tucked away in the corner of their living room like an afterthought. The keys were yellowed and some of them stuck. But when Keiko played, something magical happened. She had never taken proper lessons when she was young. Her family couldn't afford it, and besides, girls from families like hers were expected to focus on more practical things. But her mother had taught her a few simple songs, and over the years, Keiko had taught herself to play by ear. She would hear melodies on the radio or at festivals and then try to recreate them on the piano when no one was around. Playing piano was her secret joy, her escape from the daily routine. When her fingers touched the keys, she could express feelings that she didn't have words for. Sometimes she played sad songs when she missed her parents. Sometimes she played happy songs when she remembered her children as babies. And sometimes she just played whatever came into her heart, melodies that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her. After Hiroshi died, the house felt too big and too small at the same time. Her 2 children, both adults with families of their own, kept telling her she should sell the house and move closer to them in the city. They worried about her living alone, and they didn't understand why she wanted to stay in their old hometown where everything reminded her of their father. "Mother, there's nothing for you here anymore," her daughter would say during their weekly phone calls. "The store is closed, your friends are getting older, and you spend too much time by yourself." But Keiko wasn't ready to leave. This house held all her memories. The kitchen where she had cooked thousands of meals. The bedroom where she had cared for Hiroshi during his final illness. And yes, the old piano in the corner that had been her companion through so many quiet evenings. One day, while walking to the market, Keiko noticed a small poster on the community center bulletin board. "Piano lessons for beginners. All ages welcome." She stopped and read it 3 times. The teacher was a young woman named Yuki, who had recently moved to town and was offering affordable lessons to anyone who wanted to learn. For the first time in months, Keiko felt a spark of excitement. She had been playing piano for years, but she had never learned to read music properly or understand the theory behind what she was doing. Maybe it was time to finally learn the right way. When she called to ask about lessons, the teacher seemed surprised by her age but was warm and encouraging. "Music has no age limit," Yuki said cheerfully. "Some of my best students are older adults who finally have time to pursue their dreams." Keiko's first lesson was awkward. Her fingers felt clumsy as she tried to follow the sheet music, and she kept apologizing for making mistakes. But Yuki was patient and kind. When Keiko mentioned that she had been playing by ear for years, the teacher asked her to play something she knew. Keiko chose a simple Japanese folk song that her mother used to sing. As she played, her nervousness melted away. Her hands found their natural rhythm, and she played with a gentleness and emotion that surprised even herself. When she finished, Yuki was quiet for a moment. "You have something special," the teacher said softly. "You play from your heart. That's something I can't teach someone, but I can help you learn the technical skills to express that feeling even better." Over the next several months, Keiko became Yuki's most dedicated student. She practiced every day, slowly learning to read music and understand chord progressions. Her weathered hands gradually became more flexible and confident on the keys. She learned pieces by Bach, Mozart, and Chopin, composers she had only heard on the radio but never imagined she could play herself. The other students in Yuki's group classes were mostly children and teenagers, but they accepted Keiko without question. She became like a grandmother to them, always encouraging and never competitive. Some of the younger students would ask her to play the folk songs she knew, and she would teach them the melodies her mother had taught her decades ago. As winter turned to spring, Keiko found herself changing. The sadness that had settled over her after Hiroshi's death was still there, but it was softer now, mixed with something that felt like hope. Music had given her a reason to look forward to each day. She had discovered that learning new things wasn't just for young people. Her mind was still sharp, still hungry for new challenges. One afternoon, while browsing the internet at the local library, Keiko came across an advertisement for a piano competition in Tokyo. It was an open competition, meaning anyone could enter regardless of age or experience level. The prize wasn't money. It was the chance to perform at a prestigious concert hall and be recognized for musical achievement. Keiko stared at the screen for a long time. Tokyo seemed like another world, full of young, talented musicians who had been training their whole lives. What would someone like her be doing in a place like that? But something inside her whispered that maybe, just maybe, she had something to offer too. She printed out the application form and took it home. For days it sat on her kitchen table while she made excuses to herself about why she shouldn't apply. She was too old, too inexperienced, too likely to embarrass herself. But every time she sat down at her piano to practice, she remembered what Yuki had said about playing from the heart. Finally, on a quiet evening when the house felt particularly empty, Keiko filled out the application form. Her hands shook slightly as she wrote her name and age, but her signature was firm and determined. She sealed the envelope before she could change her mind and walked to the post office the next morning to mail it. She didn't tell anyone what she had done. Not her children, not her teacher, not her neighbors. It was her secret, just like her late-night piano playing had been for so many years. But this time, her secret might just change everything. 3 weeks after mailing her application, Keiko was hanging laundry in her backyard when she heard the postman's bicycle bell. She hurried to the front gate, wiping her damp hands on her apron. Among the usual bills and advertisements was a thick envelope with an official-looking logo. Her heart started beating faster as she recognized the return address from the piano competition. With trembling fingers, she opened the envelope. The letter was formal and polite, but the words that mattered most jumped out at her. "We are pleased to inform you that your application has been accepted." The competition would be held in 3 weeks at the prestigious Yamaha Concert Hall in Tokyo. Contestants were expected to perform one piece of their choice, no longer than 8 minutes. Keiko sat down heavily on her front steps, reading the letter 3 times to make sure she wasn't imagining it. Part of her was thrilled. They had accepted her. But another part was terrified. What had she gotten herself into? That evening, she called her daughter Michiko, who lived in Osaka with her husband and 2 teenage children. "Tokyo. Mother, are you serious?" Michiko's voice rose with concern. "You've never even been to Tokyo by yourself. And a piano competition? What if you get lost? What if something happens to you?" Her son Takeshi, who lived in Nagoya, was even more direct when she called him next. "Mom, I don't understand. Why are you doing this? You're 78 years old. These competitions are for young people who want to become professional musicians. You're going to embarrass yourself." His words stung, but they also made something stubborn wake up inside Keiko. "I may be old, but I'm not dead," she said quietly. "I want to do this. But what's the point? Takeshi pressed. You can play piano at home. Why do you need to prove anything to strangers? After hanging up, Keiko sat at her piano and placed her hands on the keys. Her children meant well, but they didn't understand. This wasn't about proving anything to anyone else. It was about proving something to herself. That she was still alive, still capable of growth, still had something to offer the world. The next day, she visited her piano teacher Yuki to share the news. Unlike her children, Yuki clapped her hands, together with genuine excitement. This is wonderful. I'm so proud of you for applying. What piece will you perform? They spent the next hour going through Keiko's repertoire. She had been working on several classical pieces, but Yuki suggested something that would really showcase her unique style, her ability to play with deep emotion. What about Chopin's Ballade No. 1? Yuki suggested. It's challenging, but you have the maturity to really understand what the music is trying to say. Young players often focus too much on technical perfection and miss the soul of the piece. Keiko had heard this piece before but had never attempted to learn it. As Yuki played parts of it for her, she felt something stir in her chest. The music seemed to tell a story. It had moments of gentle beauty, dramatic passion, and quiet reflection. It reminded her of life itself with all its ups and downs. It's very difficult, Keiko said hesitantly. Yes, but you have 3 weeks to prepare. And remember, you're not trying to play it perfectly. You're trying to play it truthfully. Over the following days, Keiko threw herself into practicing like never before. She worked on the piece for hours each day, her fingers slowly learning the complex passages. Some parts came naturally to her, especially the more emotional sections. Others required endless repetition until her hands remembered the movements. The neighbors began to notice. Mrs. Watanabe, who lived next door, mentioned hearing beautiful music coming from Keiko's house at all hours. You're getting very good, she said one morning as they both watered their gardens. My granddaughter takes piano lessons in the city, and she doesn't play half as beautifully as you do. As the competition date approached, Keiko faced practical challenges she hadn't considered. What should she wear? She looked through her closet and realized that most of her clothes were simple, everyday outfits, suitable for a small town but probably not appropriate for a prestigious concert hall in Tokyo. She took the train to the nearest department store and spent an entire afternoon looking for something suitable. Everything seemed too young, too expensive, or too flashy. Finally, she found a simple navy blue dress with a modest neckline and 3/4 sleeves. It wasn't fashionable, but it was dignified and comfortable. The saleswoman, who was about her daughter's age, was kind and helpful. Are you shopping for a special occasion? She asked. I'm performing in a piano competition in Tokyo, Keiko said, still hardly believing the words herself. The saleswoman's eyebrows rose in surprise, but she smiled warmly. How exciting. This dress will be perfect. You look very elegant. A week before the competition, Keiko's children made one last attempt to change her mind. They both came to visit her, arriving within an hour of each other as if they had planned it. Mom, we're worried about you, Michiko said, settling beside her on the couch. This isn't like you. You've always been so practical, so sensible. What if you fall on stage? Takeshi added. What if you forget the music? What if people laugh at you? Keiko looked at her children, both successful adults with their own families, both caring but unable to see her as anything other than their elderly mother who needed protection. Do you remember when you were little and wanted to learn to ride bicycles? She asked them. You were both so afraid of falling, but I told you that falling was part of learning, and that you'd never know if you could do it unless you tried. That's different, Michiko protested. We were children then. And I'm an adult now, making my own choices, Keiko said gently but firmly. I know I might fail. I know people might think I'm foolish, but I also know that I'll regret it forever if I don't try. The night before her departure, Keiko barely slept. She had packed and repacked her small suitcase 3 times. Her sheet music was safely tucked in a protective folder, along with the letter confirming her participation. She had checked the train schedule repeatedly and had written down the address of the concert hall in her careful handwriting. Early the next morning, she walked to the station carrying her suitcase and a small bag with her sheet music. The train to Tokyo would take 3 hours, the longest journey she had taken by herself in years. As she waited on the platform, she noticed other passengers looking at her with curiosity. A well-dressed elderly woman traveling alone with a music folder wasn't something they saw every day. When the train arrived, Keiko found her seat by the window and watched her small town disappear behind her. The rice fields gave way to suburbs, then to the sprawling cityscape of Tokyo. With each mile, she felt further from her comfortable, predictable life and closer to something unknown and frightening. But underneath the fear was something else, a growing sense of excitement. She was really doing this. After 78 years of putting everyone else first, she was finally doing something just for herself. Whether she succeeded or failed didn't matter as much as the fact that she had found the courage to try. As the train pulled into Tokyo Station, Keiko took a deep breath and gathered her belongings. The real adventure was just beginning. Tokyo Station was like nothing Keiko had ever experienced. The crowds moved like fast-flowing rivers, everyone seeming to know exactly where they were going. The announcements echoed through the vast halls in Japanese and English, creating a constant buzz of activity. Keiko stood for a moment, clutching her small suitcase and music folder, feeling completely overwhelmed. She had studied the subway map for weeks, but seeing it in person was different. The colorful lines twisted and crossed in ways that made her head spin. A kind station worker noticed her confusion and helped her find the right platform. Even his simple directions sounded complicated in the noise and chaos of the city. The ride to her hotel took 40 minutes on 2 different train lines. Keiko watched through the window as the city changed from business districts to residential areas and back again. Everything was so much bigger and faster than her quiet hometown. By the time she reached her destination, her legs felt shaky and her heart was beating fast. The hotel was small but clean, located 3 blocks from the concert hall. The young man at the front desk spoke polite, formal Japanese and handed her a key card that she didn't quite understand how to use. After 2 attempts, a cleaning lady showed her how to tap it against the door sensor. Her room was tiny but had everything she needed: a narrow bed, a small desk, and a window that looked out onto a busy street. She sat on the edge of the bed and called her daughter to let her know she had arrived safely. "How is it, Mother?" Michiko asked, her voice tight with worry. "It's very big," Keiko said honestly. "And loud. But I'm fine. You can still come home," her daughter said hopefully. "There's no shame in changing your mind." After hanging up, Keiko unpacked her few belongings and laid her navy blue dress carefully on the bed. Tomorrow was the competition. She had traveled all this way, and now she had to follow through. That evening, she walked to the concert hall to see it in person. The Yamaha concert hall stood like a modern temple, all glass and steel reaching toward the sky. Well-dressed people were streaming in for some kind of evening performance. Keiko stood across the street watching them. Everyone looked so sophisticated, so confident, so young. A group of people about her children's age walked past, speaking in English and laughing about something. Their clothes were stylish and expensive-looking. She looked down at her simple outfit. Comfortable walking shoes, a plain skirt, and a cardigan her daughter had given her years ago. What was she doing here? The next morning, Keiko woke up before dawn. She couldn't eat much breakfast. Her stomach was tied in knots. She spent an hour getting ready, carefully styling her gray hair and putting on the navy dress she had bought, specially for this day. In the hotel mirror, she looked like exactly what she was, a 78-year-old woman from the countryside trying her best to look presentable. She arrived at the concert hall 2 hours early, even though registration didn't start until 10 o'clock. Other contestants were already gathering in the lobby. Most of them looked like they were in their 20s or 30s. Many carried expensive instrument cases and wore clothes that clearly cost more than Keiko spent on groceries in a month. She found a corner near the registration table and sat quietly, holding her folder with her sheet music. A group of young women near her were discussing their training. One had studied at a famous music school in Europe. Another had won several competitions already. Their conversation was full of technical terms that Keiko didn't understand. When registration opened, Keiko joined the line. The two young men ahead of her were talking confidently about their performance pieces, complex works by Rachmaninoff and Liszt that Keiko had heard of, but never attempted to play. When they noticed her behind them, they glanced at each other, with barely hidden smirks. "Are you here for the senior citizens program?" one of them asked, not unkindly but clearly assuming she was lost. "No, I'm competing," Keiko said quietly. Their expressions changed to surprise, then to something that looked almost like pity. "Oh," the first young man said. "That's nice." At the registration desk, the volunteer, a woman in her 40s with perfectly styled hair and a professional smile, looked confused when Keiko handed over her paperwork. "Let me just double-check this," she said, typing something into her computer. "Keiko Tanaka, age 78, performing Chopin's Ballade No. 1. She looked up with raised eyebrows. "Is this information correct?" "Yes," Keiko said, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "Okay," the woman said slowly, printing out a name tag and performance schedule. "You're number 23 out of 30 contestants. The competition starts at 2 o'clock. Please be in the green room by 1:30. Keiko took her materials and found a seat in the lobby. Around her, conversations buzzed with nervous energy. She caught fragments of discussions about technique, interpretation, and career goals. A young woman sitting nearby was doing finger exercises in the air, her hands moving in complex patterns. Another contestant was listening to music through expensive headphones, his eyes closed in concentration. As the morning progressed, more people arrived. Some were clearly family members, parents with cameras, siblings offering encouragement. Others looked like teachers or coaches giving last-minute advice to their students. Keiko noticed that she was the only person sitting alone. Around noon, a well-dressed couple approached her. The woman looked to be in her 50s and had the confident bearing of someone used to being in charge. "Excuse me," she said with a polite but condescending smile. "Are you perhaps looking for the community senior recital? That's being held in the smaller hall next door." "No, thank you," Keiko replied. "I'm competing here today." The woman's husband leaned in. "Are you sure? These competitions can be quite intense. Perhaps there's been some mistake with your registration." Other people nearby were starting to notice the conversation. Keiko felt dozens of eyes on her as she spoke quietly but firmly. "There's no mistake. I'm supposed to be here." The couple exchanged a look that clearly said they thought she was confused or delusional. "Well," the woman said with forced brightness, "good luck then." As they walked away, Keiko heard them whispering to each other. She couldn't make out all the words, but she heard enough. Embarrassing. Someone should tell her, at her age. The afternoon brought more of the same. When contestants were called to the green room, Keiko noticed the staff member leading them do a double-take when she joined the group. In the waiting area, conversations stopped when she entered. She could feel the other contestants studying, her trying to figure out what she was doing there. A young man with perfectly styled hair and designer clothes sat down next to her. "First competition?" he asked with the kind of smile that wasn't quite friendly. "Yes," Keiko admitted. "It shows," he said, looking her up and down. "These events can be pretty overwhelming for people who aren't used to them. Are you sure you're ready for this?" Before Keiko could answer, another contestant, a young woman with bright pink hair, joined the conversation. "I think it's sweet that you're trying," she said, in a tone usually reserved for talking to small children. "Music should be for everyone, right? Even if some people start later in life." The condescension in her voice was so thick that Keiko felt her face burn with embarrassment. Around the room, she could see other contestants nudging each other and stealing glances in her direction. Someone's phone was pointed her way, probably taking a photo to share with friends later. When the competition began, Keiko listened to the first few performers from the green room. They were undeniably skilled, playing complex pieces with technical precision that made her own abilities seem amateur by comparison. Each performance was met with polite applause from the audience in the main hall. As her turn approached, the whispers around her grew louder. She heard someone say something about hoping she wouldn't embarrass herself too badly. Another person wondered aloud if there was an age limit they should consider implementing for future competitions. Finally, her name was called. Contestant number 23, Keiko Tanaka. The room fell silent as she stood up, smoothing down her navy dress. Her hands were shaking slightly as she picked up her sheet music, though she had memorized the piece weeks ago. The walk from the green room to the stage felt like the longest journey of her life. As she stepped onto the stage and saw the audience for the first time, Keiko realized that this moment would either be her greatest triumph or her most public humiliation. There was no going back now. The concert hall was bigger than Keiko had imagined. Row after row of red velvet seats stretched back into the darkness, filled with hundreds of people. The stage lights were so bright that she could barely see the audience, but she could feel their eyes on her. In the front rows, she spotted the judges, 5 serious-looking people with notebooks and pens, their faces showing polite but skeptical attention. Keiko walked slowly across the stage, her sensible shoes making soft sounds on the polished wood floor. Each step felt deliberate and careful, like she was walking on ice. Behind her, she could hear whispers from the audience, not loud enough to make out words, but the tone was unmistakable. Some people were already pulling out their phones, probably expecting to record something they could share later as entertainment. The piano sat in the center of the stage like a sleeping giant. It was a beautiful black grand piano, much larger and more impressive than the small upright piano in her living room back home. As she approached it, Keiko felt a mixture of fear and excitement. This instrument was probably worth more than her entire house. She placed her sheet music on the piano's music stand, even though she had memorized every note weeks ago. Having it there felt like having a friend nearby. Her hands were trembling slightly as she adjusted the bench to the right height. In the audience, someone coughed, and the sound echoed through the hall like a small explosion. One of the judges glanced at his watch and then looked at her with the expression of someone trying to be patient. Another judge whispered something to the person next to her, and they both looked up at Keiko with what seemed like mild curiosity mixed with doubt. From the wings of the stage, Keiko could see some of the other contestants watching. The young man with the designer clothes was shaking his head slightly, as if he felt sorry for what was about to happen. The girl with pink hair had her phone out, ready to record. Keiko sat down on the bench and placed her feet on the pedals. The silence in the hall was heavy and uncomfortable. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. For a moment, she wondered if her children had been right. Maybe she was too old for this. Maybe she had made a terrible mistake. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. In her mind, she went back to her small house, to the quiet evenings when she would play piano after everyone else had gone to sleep. She remembered the feeling of the music flowing through her fingers, the way playing had helped her through her grief after Hiroshi died. She thought about her piano teacher Yuki, who had said she played from her heart. When Keiko opened her eyes and placed her hands on the keys, something changed. The nervousness was still there, but underneath it was something stronger, a quiet confidence that came from years of living, loving, and learning. She began to play the opening notes of Chopin's Ballet No. 1. The first few measures were gentle, almost tentative, like someone telling the beginning of a long story. Her fingers moved across the keys with careful precision, but there was something more than technical skill in her playing. There was a warmth, a depth of feeling that couldn't be taught in any music school. The audience grew quieter. The whispers stopped. Even the judges looked up from their notebooks with renewed attention. This wasn't what they had expected to hear. The piece continued, Keiko's playing grew more confident. The melody began to soar and dance, moving from gentle passages to more dramatic ones. Her weathered hands, which had kneaded bread and folded laundry for decades, now moved across the piano keys with surprising grace and strength. Every note seemed to carry the weight of her experiences, the joy of raising children, the satisfaction of hard work, the pain of loss, and the quiet hope of new beginnings. In the audience, Phones that had been raised to record an embarrassing moment were slowly lowered. People leaned forward in their seats, drawn in by something they hadn't expected to find. The young contestants watching from the wings stopped whispering to each other and stood transfixed. The middle section of the ballade was more challenging, with complex passages that required both technical skill and emotional understanding. Keiko navigated these difficult parts not with the flashy showmanship of a young virtuoso, but with the steady wisdom of someone who understood that music wasn't about impressing people. It was about touching their hearts. One of the judges put down his pen entirely and simply listened. Another closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her. In the audience, an elderly man in the third row wiped his eyes with a handkerchief. A young mother holding a baby found that her child had stopped fussing and was listening with wide, peaceful eyes. As the piece built toward its climactic moments, Keiko's playing became more passionate and intense. But it wasn't the aggressive intensity of youth trying to prove itself. It was the controlled power of someone who had lived through real drama and knew the difference between making noise and making music. Her hands moved with increasing urgency across the keys, telling a story of struggle and triumph that everyone in the hall could understand, regardless of their age or background. The young man with designer clothes who had been so condescending earlier found his mouth falling open. The girl with pink hair lowered her phone completely, no longer thinking about social media but simply experiencing the music. Some of the other contestants looked at each other with expressions of surprise and growing respect. In the most technically challenging section of the piece, where many young pianists would focus on speed and precision, Keiko played with a different kind of mastery. She understood that technique should serve the music, not the other way around. Her fingers found every note, but more importantly, every note had purpose and meaning. The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every phrase. This wasn't just a piano recital anymore. It was a master class in how life experience could transform music into something transcendent. People who had come expecting to hear talented young musicians were instead witnessing something much rarer: the performance of someone who had lived long enough to truly understand what the composer was trying to say. As the ballade moved toward its conclusion, the music became gentler again, like a storm gradually calming into peaceful rain. Keiko's playing reflected this shift perfectly, her hands moving with tender precision through the final passages. The last notes hung in the air like dewdrops, beautiful and fragile. When she played the final chord and lifted her hands from the keys, the silence that followed was different from the uncomfortable quiet that had greeted her arrival on stage. This silence was filled with awe, with respect, and with the recognition that they had just witnessed something extraordinary. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds, nobody moved. The judges stared at her with expressions of amazement. The audience sat motionless, as if they were afraid that any sound might break the spell she had cast. Then, slowly, one person began to clap, then another. Then suddenly the entire concert hall erupted in thunderous applause. People rose to their feet, clapping not just politely but with genuine enthusiasm and admiration. The judges were applauding. The other contestants were applauding. Even the concert hall staff, who had seen hundreds of performances, were clapping with obvious appreciation. Keiko sat at the piano bench for a moment, hardly believing what was happening. Then she stood and bowed gracefully, the way her mother had taught her to bow when she was a little girl. The applause grew even louder. As she walked off the stage carrying her sheet music, Keiko felt like she was floating. She had done it. She had taken the biggest risk of her life, and it had paid off in ways she never could have imagined. The green room felt completely different when Keiko returned. The same contestants who had whispered and smirked at her just an hour earlier now looked at her with genuine respect. The young man with designer clothes, who had questioned whether she was ready for the competition, stood up when she entered. "That was incredible," he said, and this time his voice held no condescension. "I've never heard Chopin played like that. You made it sound like a story from real life." The girl with pink hair, who had called her sweet in such a patronizing way, approached with tears still visible in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I was wrong about you. That performance, it changed how I think about music." Other contestants gathered around, asking questions about her technique, her interpretation, her background. Some admitted they had been filming her expecting something embarrassing, but had put their phones away within the first minute of her performance. The atmosphere in the room had transformed completely. Word of Keiko's performance spread quickly throughout the concert hall. Staff members who hadn't planned to watch any of the competition were suddenly finding excuses to peek into the auditorium. The remaining contestants after her had to follow what many people were already calling the performance of the day. When the competition ended and results were announced, Keiko didn't win first place. That went to a talented young man who had trained at prestigious conservatories for years. But she won something more meaningful, the People's Choice Award, voted on by the audience members themselves. More importantly, she had won something inside herself that couldn't be measured by any competition. After the awards ceremony, people surrounded her. A reporter from a local arts magazine asked for an interview. Several audience members wanted to shake her hand and share how her music had moved them. An elderly woman told her that watching her perform had inspired her to start taking art classes again after retiring. But the most unexpected moment came when 3 young contestants approached her together. They were students at Tokyo's most competitive music school, all winners of previous competitions. "Would you consider teaching us?" one of them asked seriously. "Not technique. We have teachers for that. But what you have, that connection to the music, that's something we want to learn." Keiko was so surprised she didn't know what to say at first. "But I'm not a professional teacher," she said. "I just learned to play properly myself." "That's exactly why we want to learn from you," another student said. "You play like someone who has really lived. We play like we're trying to impress judges. There's a difference." The train ride back to her hometown felt like traveling between 2 different worlds. Keiko's phone, which usually sat silent for days, buzzed constantly with messages. Her piano teacher Yuki had seen videos of the performance online and was practically bouncing with excitement. Her neighbors back home had somehow found out and were calling to congratulate her. But the most important calls came from her children. Michiko phoned first, her voice thick with emotion. "Mom, I saw the video. Someone shared it on social media and—" "I'm sorry. I was wrong to doubt you. I had no idea you could play like that." When Takeshi called an hour later, he sounded different, too. "I've been thinking about what you said, about being willing to fall while learning to ride a bicycle. I guess I forgot that you taught me to be brave first. I'm proud of you, Mom." Within days of returning home, Keiko's quiet life was turned upside down in the best possible way. The video of her performance, recorded by audience members on their phones, had spread across the internet. People from around the world were sharing it with comments about how her music had touched them. A major newspaper wanted to write a feature story about her. A television talk show invited her to appear as a guest. Most surprisingly, she received invitations to perform at concert halls in other cities, not as a competitor, but as a featured artist. The young students from Tokyo kept their word. They arranged to visit her hometown on weekends, making the long train journey to take lessons from the 78-year-old woman who had shown them what music could really mean. Keiko's small living room, with its old upright piano, became an informal music school where technical skill met life wisdom. More local seniors heard about Keiko's story and became interested in music lessons. Yuki, her original teacher, was suddenly busier than she had ever been. The community center had to add evening classes to accommodate all the new students who wanted to start learning instruments. "You've started something," Yuki told Keiko one afternoon as they watched a class full of people over 60 learning to play piano together. "People are realizing it's never too late to try something new." But perhaps the most meaningful change was in Keiko herself. The woman who had spent decades putting everyone else's needs first was learning to value her own dreams and abilities. She accepted some of the performance invitations, traveling to cities she had never seen to share her music with new audiences. At each performance, she met people who told her that her story had inspired them to pursue their own long-delayed dreams. A retired businessman had started painting again. A grandmother had signed up for dancing lessons. A widower had begun writing poetry. Her courage had given others permission to be brave, too. 6 months after the competition, Keiko was invited back to the same concert hall where she had faced ridicule and doubt. This time, she was the featured performer at a special concert celebrating lifelong learning in the arts. The same venue that had once felt so intimidating now welcomed her like an old friend. The audience that night included her children and grandchildren, who had traveled from their cities to hear her play. It included her neighbors from her small town, who had chartered a bus to make the trip. It included the young music students who now called her their teacher, and the seniors from her community, who had started their own musical journeys inspired by her example. As Keiko walked onto the stage that night, she thought about the journey that had brought her there. It had started with grief and loneliness after her husband's death. It had continued with small steps, piano lessons at the community center, hours of practice in her quiet house, the courage to mail an application to a competition in Tokyo. The applause that greeted her was warm and welcoming, so different from the skeptical silence she had faced months earlier. But the most important difference was in herself. She no longer felt like an old woman trying to prove she belonged somewhere. She felt like a musician who had found her voice. When she began to play that night, it was the same Chopin ballade that had changed everything. But her interpretation had grown even deeper, enriched by all the experiences that had followed her first performance. The music told not just the story of one piece, but the story of a life transformed by the courage to try something new. After the concert, as people gathered around her with congratulations and gratitude, Keiko realized that winning the competition had never been the real goal. The real victory was much bigger. It was proving to herself and to the world that dreams don't have expiration dates, that talent can bloom at any age, and that it's never too late to discover who you really are. Her story had become more than just one woman's musical achievement. It had become a reminder that life's most beautiful chapters might still be waiting to be written, no matter how old the book might seem.